Good evening, and welcome to the Southern Environmental Law Center's 2024 Philip D. Reed Environmental Writing Award Ceremony. Please welcome to the stage SELC's Climate Initiative Leader, Elise Campaign.
Hello. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 Philip D. Reed Environmental Writing Awards Ceremony. We are delighted that you are here and joining us today as we celebrate some of this year's very finest environmental writing. For 30 years, SELC has presented the Reed Award to recognize the writing that best captures the extraordinary beauty and the unique environmental challenges that we face here in the South. The writers who tell these stories play an absolutely essential role in informing and engaging the public. This year, our judges reviewed so many excellent pieces of work. I'm told that choosing just 2 winning entries was an exceedingly difficult task. So all of our finalists, who you can see here behind me, deserve big congratulations. We're so thankful for each and every one of you, and we're thrilled that many of you could join us here this evening. Thank you. Later in our ceremony, we'll hear from our Reed Award winners, Emily Strasser, David Folkenflik, Mario Ariza, and Miranda Green, as well as from our special guest speaker, author and CBS News reporter Jonathan Vigliotti. Each has used their storytelling talents to draw attention to critically important environmental issues impacting the South, from a nuclear waste Superfund site in Tennessee to power companies that are buying favorable news coverage in Alabama and in Florida, to the impact of climate change on small-town America. But before we get to these remarkable writers, we'd like to do a little bit of storytelling of our own. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the Reed Award, and today feels like the perfect occasion to look back on its history. So please enjoy this short retrospective film.
The Reed Environmental Writing Award was created in honor of Philip Dudley Reed. Phil was a dedicated environmentalist who fell in love with the emerging field of environmental law while attending Yale Law School. In 1986, his former classmate and close friend Rick Middleton approached him with an idea: to create a legal nonprofit organization, one focused on protecting the South's unique environment. Phil jumped at the chance, joining as one of the first board members of what would become the Southern Environmental Law Center. Working with a handful of dedicated attorneys, Rick, Phil, and SELC's other founding members were guided by the belief that people everywhere, including here in the South, deserve to breathe healthy air, drink clean water, and live in thriving communities free from harmful pollution. But tragically, just as their labor of love began to flourish, Phil passed away unexpectedly at 47, leaving behind his beloved wife Elizabeth and 2 young sons. As a friend later wrote, Phil was a unique character with a life force that death cannot extinguish, and which will live on in all who had the good fortune to know him. Here at SELC, his memory lives on in the Philip D. Reed Environmental Writing Award. Now in its 30th year, the Reed Award pays tribute to Phil's lasting impact on SELC. Since its creation, the Reed Award has honored nearly 60 book authors, essayists, and journalists, writers who have explored a wide range of environmental subjects, from America's Amazon in Alabama to the vanishing watermen of Tangier Island in Virginia. This year, as every year, the Reed Award nominees are doing their part to protect our environment here in the South, just as Phil Reed sought to do in his time here with us. Please join us in honoring his legacy.
That was truly a moving testimonial. I know I'm so honored to be a part of this annual event to honor Phil and all of the extraordinary writers who've used their talents to make the South a better place. It's always a treat to get to celebrate authors who link the power of place and the power of story, just as our special guest speaker, Jonathan Vigliotti, has done through his reporting and writing. As many of our book festival attendees probably know, Jonathan is an Emmy Award-winning CBS News national correspondent, but he's also an author, having recently completed his first book titled Before It's Gone: Stories from the Front Lines of Climate Change in Small-Town America. We are fortunate to have advanced copies for sale after today's awards program, and his book is scheduled for release nationwide on April 2nd, just in time for Earth Month. As I'm sure many of you would agree, climate change can be abstract and difficult to understand, and yet it is also utterly personal. It touches all of us, whether we choose to see it and name it or not. Jonathan has seen the climate emergency unfolding in real time through his reporting. And in his new book, he shares firsthand accounts of how the climate crisis is already here, in the form of massive forest fires in Hawaii and California, inland flooding in North Carolina, and devastated fisheries in Alaska. Jonathan's writing makes it clear that the time to act is now. The book couldn't come at a more critical moment. Historic federal climate investments are finally arriving in communities across the country. Those funds need to be spent wisely and with community buy-in on solutions shaped by local needs, like those that Jonathan writes about. Whether that means, say, giving a grant to a small farmer to help them use solar power to irrigate their fields, or funding a town cooling station and a battery-powered safe place to go during power outages, or helping to secure an affordable place to retreat to on high ground as climate impacts advance. We need to invest in locally tailored climate solutions. Before It's Gone is the story of America, and it's America on the edge. It makes a powerful argument that radical action on climate change with respect for its people and traditions is not only possible, but it's the only way to preserve what we love. Here at SELC, we could not agree more. So please help me welcome our very special guest speaker, Jonathan Vigliotti. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you, Elise, for that very kind introduction. Before I get started, I just want to point out I'm wearing the same exact suit as that photo. I don't get out, well, I try to leave the studio as often as possible. I don't put this on too much. You may have noticed that I also brought a bag. I'm a television journalist. I like a prop. So please forgive me. I'll get to this in a second. In the meantime, and before I get started, I just want to say thank you to the Southern Environmental Law Center for the invitation to be here tonight. It is my honor to join everybody in recognizing this evening's recipients, and congratulations on the achievement. We all come from different backgrounds in this room. I know that is not a news flash, and I promise to stop using news puns, but I would like to think that we are all connected by at least one common thread, and that is our shared passion for the environment and our drive to protect it. Where does that drive come from? What was that moment that we all connected with nature and found wonder in it? For me, it was a question that I have had a lot of time to reflect on. It took me 3 years to write this book, and it's a journey that began as a kid growing up in the 90s in a small town called Mount Kisco in a big state called New York. And back then, if you went to the Blue House or the Red Door on Meadowbrook Lane and you asked my parents where I was, they would likely say I was off playing in the nearby woods. Those woods are where I spent most of my time, and I did everything there. I wrote in my journal, I read, I listened to music, I reflected, and I found peace there. Those woods were like my church. And I say that as a Roman Catholic with tremendous Catholic guilt, but God understands. Those woods are also where I understood just how fragile our ecosystem, our environment is, because around the same time, there was a housing development planned in those very woods. And this is also the time where I learned just how powerful words are, and in this case, written words. Because my parents, along with so many other people in the community, came together and wrote letters to local leaders in protest of that development. They were specifically concerned about the impact the development would have on nearby wetlands and nesting birds. In the end, I would like to think those words mattered because that development was scrapped. And today, when I return back home to that blue house with the red door on Meadowbrook Lane, where my parents still live, thank God, I go to those woods as well, where I still reflect and daydream. I spend most of my time as a journalist, and especially early on in my career, focused specifically on similar environmental crossroads. Just a few years ago, I was here in Virginia and North Carolina. I was trekking through a cotton field with my producer, Walker Dawson. We had a camera and we had a drone, and we were filming trees being chopped down and turned into wood pellets for an industry that sold itself as a green alternative, even though I know the Law Center here knows and all the scientists we spoke with knew it was anything but. Enviva, one of the largest manufacturers of wood pellets, filed for bankruptcy just last week. Most recently, I spent a lot of my time pinballing across the country. It's why I don't wear a suit too often, covering extreme weather, as Elise pointed out, everything from wildfires and hurricanes to tornadoes. And that has been, for me, a priceless education, where I have been given access to unusual front lines, where I would like to think most people don't have access to, and where I have been able to directly connect the dots between climate change, its impact that it's having on radicalizing our weather, and the impact that extreme weather is having on our main streets. Which brings me to my prop. Again, forgive me. This bag comes with me wherever I go in the field. It's like my insurance policy. It has everything I need to get through work, wherever I may be, from my computer to a flashlight. We often work very early in the morning for live shots. I have a backup battery supply, but the most valuable of tools is my leather-bound journal. This is the latest of, I'd say, at least 20 that I have. And I write in it at the end of every reporting trip to reflect and take stock of what I just seen. This became invaluable when I was writing my book. I had this journal and I had this bag with me when I was launched to what would become the deadliest wildfire in modern American history. In this journal, I have what I used to say as a bookmark. It's a folded piece of paper. But back when I first wrote on this, August 9th of last year, I used it to help me remember how to pronounce the name of the town that I'd be reporting live from. I didn't want to mess it up. I taped it underneath the bottom of the lens of the camera, and I would look at it, and I don't know if anybody was watching those reports, if you could tell that I was trying to say it correctly. I wrote Lahaina. Lahaina is probably as far west as we could get from where we're standing today while still being in the United States. But what happened there should serve as a lesson to all of us. As I have learned on the front lines, before every disaster, there is usually a scientist that has been ignored. And if you want to expand on that, there is also usually survivors who have been forgotten. When we first arrived in Lahaina, we didn't drive up into the main street. There was a roadblock that police had set up, and they told us, my team of us, that we couldn't get through because it was too dangerous. But we were there at this roadblock with other residents, survivors who had evacuated and were desperately trying to get back in to check in on their homes. And they all told us that the reason we weren't being allowed in is because officials didn't want us to report on what they were describing at the time as a failed emergency response. So we chartered a boat, and an hour and a half later, we were deposited along a cindered shoreline, what I have described in my book and through my experience as an environmental holocaust. Home after home, business after business was decimated. We're talking 80% of the town. We were one of the first crews to get there to see this. More than 100 people were killed. And in those first, I would say 10, 20 minutes, we had a very limited time the first time we got there because of the setting sun, I was struck by all of the survivors, people who were in their homes at the time, escaped, survived, and were taking stock of what little was left. So many people were in this state of shock. Some looked like ghosts. They even had ash on their face. We made several trips back and forth to Lahaina in those first 3 days before FEMA arrived and taped off the entire area. And as we made those trips back, one of the most haunting moments and scenes in my career was this line of cars stuck in this gridlock of traffic, frozen in time by fire. I would say about 100 easily. They had all been burned and reduced to just their metal frames. As we learned from survivors, there was no emergency evacuation order. The fire was unknown to so many people until some literally saw it outside their window and in a panic state rushed to their car to try to escape. But the flames quickly caught up with them. And in that desperate effort, they ran out and jumped into the Pacific Ocean for safety and survival. We didn't see any first responders, by the way, for the first 3 days, just like we were told. And I want to give you more perspective on that because I met one woman who worked at a local hotel who gives a better understanding to what happens when we're not prepared and when we don't listen to the science. She tried to evacuate. She saw the smoke, but then she also saw that gridlock of traffic, and she turned back around and went to the hotel. And in that hotel were hundreds of guests who also did not evacuate. They didn't have cell service. They had no idea what was going on. So they figured it would be safe to just wait. The first day, they waited without water. They waited without any kind of electricity, and food was running out. They hoped someone would arrive. On the second day, they ran out of most of their food, so they started rationing it off to just the children. They still hoped that help would arrive. As she described it to me, there was an airport a mile and a half away, there was a dock behind the hotel, and yet by day 3, no one was knocking on their door. So she made the decision to get in her car. She had no idea what she was getting into, to drive down the one road 13 miles out of town to get help. She prayed to God the entire time. She was surprised to see that there was not a single downed tree or power line blocking that road and no first responders. 13 miles later, she gets to the end of this road where that police roadblock, the same roadblock we had bypassed, was. And on the other end of that roadblock, she was angry to see hundreds of volunteers, citizens who had food and water, medical supplies that wanted to get them in, and they weren't allowed in. In the days and weeks that followed, we listened as local leaders described this fire as an explosion, like a bomb going off, is what they specifically said, as if to imply there was no time to take action or there was no warning. But in the days and weeks that followed, we also learned something else that we started to report. There was a years-long fuse that could have been put out at any point. Because in 2014, scientists on the island had come together and they put out a report saying that the area was getting more susceptible to fire because of how hot the temperatures were getting. Climate change was having this massive impact. And they also had suggestions, things that could be done to prevent wildfire, things that Elise just talked about, where you could build a home in a more sustainable way using fire-resistant materials to prevent a fire from spreading in a home once it made its way onto a roof. Or reducing, and I'm going to step away just to drink some water, forgive me as my mouth gets dry. Now I think my words will be clearer. Thank you for that. Reducing invasive grasses that had taken root and had essentially turned the area into a tinderbox. They also suggested restoring the wetlands, which had been depleted because of population growth, and conserving water, which had been exhausted because of the rise in tourism in the area. Ultimately, though, those warnings were ignored and left unheeded. It all became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Again, over 100 people were killed in that fire. But in the devastation, there was this one thing that I saw in a miles-long path of destruction. It was one home still standing. It was left entirely unscathed. It's known as the house with the red roof today by locals. This is a home where the residents had listened to those warnings and had implemented those scientific remedies. They had created defensible space around their homes, removing invasive grasses, taking down trees and bushes. They also put kind of a moat, a stone moat of river stones around the house. So if a fire burned on the grass, which it did that day, it would stop at that moat and not reach the foundation of this home. And they also put that red roof on top of their house, which they funded because of tax credits. And it made their insurance costs cheaper as a result. Across the country, in all of the disasters that I have seen and experienced reporting live from, there are examples of homes with the red roof. homes that have survived when most of the other neighborhoods have not. So what do all of these people share in common? They listened and they took action. And we're all good at listening and taking action when the stories, when the warnings are clear, when we understand the cause and the effect. One of the inspirations for this book for me before it's gone was Dan Gilbert. He's a Harvard psychologist, and he gave a TED Talk years ago. I first watched it probably 8 years ago, and he was specifically talking about the key to happiness. But he mentioned the prefrontal cortex, this part of our brain that is unlike any other animal in the kingdom, and it gives us this incredible ability to imagine things before they happen. It's this evolutionary adaptation that essentially prevents us from doing stupid things. And one of the things that triggers this part of our imagination is storytelling. Stories that are shared to us by friends, by family, by strangers, by the media. It's incredibly impactful when the message is clear. Who here has seen one of those anti-smoking campaigns on television, the ones that feature someone in some state of suffering warning others not to pick up a pack of cigarettes? Well, in New York City, the health department found for every dollar it spent on its campaign, it saved $32 in medical costs. So people listened, they saw those images, they were able to clearly see the threat as a result, and they took action to protect themselves, to protect their families. But when it comes to climate change, a lot of us, maybe not in this room, but a lot of people in general, seem to have turned off that part of their imagination. There's a risk mitigation agency, it's called Aon. It tracks real estate and where people move. And they found in the last decade, 6 times more people moved to coastal areas here on the East Coast prone to flooding than to nearby inland communities that were much safer. Now, I don't think these are people that are trying to put themselves in harm's way. Many of them have 30-year mortgages. You would think that they would expect to have that home for at least 30 years. They just didn't truly understand. And so why is that? Elise mentioned this in her introduction to me, probably more eloquently than I will. It's a failure to imagine. It's this idea that when you have a home or when you have a space, you take it for granted. And so many people were taking it for granted and overwhelmed by climate science. They didn't understand it. They found it to be too distracting, too confusing. And there's other science that also shows that the daunting solutions make people turn the lights off, turn the imagination off when it comes to how to solve climate change. And I understand because climate change is a complex issue that requires the entire global community to come together to reduce our global emissions so that we can reduce the harmful impacts to our changing climate. But even if we were to reduce all of our greenhouse gases today, we would still have, in what is a delayed feedback loop, a decades-long journey ahead before we see a positive impact on our extreme weather. We have to focus on, of course, reducing our use of fossil fuels. But in the meantime, there are solutions that we as individuals can take immediately and as individual communities that don't require global buy-in, and that's specifically habitat change and reversing our impacts on our habitat. So being more careful where we build, listening to the science, and restoring our waterways, restoring our wetlands, protecting our woodlands, like the woodlands in Mount Kisco, and protecting the woodlands here in Virginia and North Carolina. In doing so, we have the ability to build stronger, more resilient communities. I speak to you from the perspective of a journalist, but I would like to think all of us in this room are storytellers. If you've ever been to a bar to catch up with a friend or ever gossiped with somebody, then you understand this. We all have the ability through the power of our words to change the way that people see the world around them. And we must turn that part of our brains back on. The way we do it is by clearly identifying the cause, talking about the science, telling the stories about survivors, what they went through, what they would do differently, to inspire not just that imagination of the worst case scenario, but a better way forward, and to also hold our leaders accountable. The journalists in front of me have all succeeded at doing that, and congratulations on your work. And it's something that we must all continue to aspire to. I certainly try to aspire to that in the work that I do. We can and we must, and to plug my book, before it's gone. Thank you very much for the invitation here again. I appreciate it.
Now, please welcome to the stage the leader of SELC's Environmental Justice Initiative and senior attorney, Chandra Taylor Sawyer.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was very, very inspiring, informative. We appreciate you and look forward to many of you purchasing the new book. Now, it's my absolute pleasure to recognize this year's Reed Award winners, starting with the winner of the Reed Environmental Writing Award for a nonfiction book, Emily Strasser, and her book, Half-Life of a Secret, Reckoning with a Hidden History. Emily's previous writing has appeared in numerous journals and magazines, from the Bitter Southerner to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientist. She was also the presenter of the 2020 BBC podcast, The Bomb. Now, in her first book, Emily uses her exceptional narrative skills to share a deeply researched memoir tracing her journey to confront a toxic legacy of secrecy, her grandfather's work building nuclear weapons in the atomic city of Oak Ridge, Tennessee. In Half-Life of a Secret, we join Emily as she travels from the deserts of Nevada to the living rooms of Hiroshima, digging through archives and family memories to uncover the secrets of her grandfather's past. She ties her own family's culture of secrecy to the institutionalized secrecy of the nuclear industry, a secrecy that persists with grave consequences to this day. Returning to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Emily reveals the widespread contamination which still remains there as a result of nuclear weapons production. In 1989, the EPA designated much of the Oak Ridge Reservation a Superfund site, and the Department of Energy has been attempting to clean it up ever since. Unfortunately, the Department of Energy plans to bury contaminated waste on site and discharge pollutants, including chemicals known to cause cancer, into a nearby creek without fully treating them. SELC has worked with community groups to push back on that dangerous plan. That's one of the many reasons why we're so honored to have Emily Strasser shedding light on this incredibly important environmental issue. Please help me welcome the 2024 Reed Award winner for nonfiction book, Emily Strasser.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chandra, for the really generous introduction. Thank you all. I'm really grateful to be here, grateful to the Southern Environmental Law Center and to the judges for recognizing my book in this way. So earlier today, I was invited by the SELC content team to contribute to a section of their magazine called My South, in which people describe their favorite natural places in the South. And I'll be honest with you, my first instinct was that I didn't want to do it because it's complicated. Because when I think of my South, I think of my grandmother's house on Watts Bar Lake, a dammed arm of the Tennessee River in East Tennessee. I think of winding country roads, rolling hills, fence lines thick with wild blackberries, black-eyed Susans, Queen Anne's lace. I think of this landscape of my childhood where I felt most loved, whole, and free. And now I know this place is contaminated with mercury, cesium, and other chemical and radioactive materials from the nuclear weapons industry in Oak Ridge, where my grandfather spent his career from World War II into the Cold War. Now I know that my grandfather, in a management role,
played a hand in contaminating his home, the place he raised his family. I didn't want to talk about my South because I do not have a simple answer, because I still grieve the innocent love I once had for this place. That's funny, of course, because the whole reason I'm here is that I wrote a book about my complicated relationship to this place. This is not where that book started. When I started, it did start out of love for this place haunted by a legacy of violence. But when I thought of the violence of the bomb, I thought of outside and over there. I thought of Hiroshima. I thought of nuclear weapons testing and fallout. I thought of Nagasaki. I thought of the historical violence and existential threats to the future from the bomb. I interviewed, read, and traveled widely. I looked everywhere but back home. I looked everywhere but here and now. I'm going to tell you something that's not in the book. Years ago, at the very beginning of this work, before I had any idea of the scope of it, I interviewed a close friend of my grandfather's. I was hoping to learn something about my grandfather's mental illness, another buried thread of this story. I was trying to understand the way family and national secrets intersected. The man was soft voice, a protective friend, careful about what he said. A few days later, I was in the archives at the Oak Ridge Public Library when he called me. He told me in a low voice something about a whistleblower, mercury contamination, professional retribution. I took a few notes, thanked him, and hung up. I felt sick, scared, and I put the information aside, returning to the map of wartime Oak Ridge I'd been studying. I was going in historical order, I told myself, but also I didn't want to know. It would be years before I would turn to that thread, and then I would learn how, in the Cold War frenzy of the 1950s and 60s, hundreds of thousands of pounds of mercury were released into the air, land, and local waterways of Oak Ridge, under the watch of my grandfather and others like him, producing an essential fuel component for the hydrogen bomb. Rushed practices and inadequate safety measures were justified as necessary in the race against the Soviets. And though workers and management knew about the problems, they knew that mercury was leaking, it was kept from the public, which was possible because of the strict security measures surrounding nuclear weapons work. The contamination was finally uncovered in the early 1980s, before I was born, and just before my grandfather's death. The family friend who called me, he wasn't revealing anything not already in the public record. But his cautiousness, decades later, was indicative of a toxic culture of secrecy in Oak Ridge, a culture created and maintained by the nuclear weapons industry in the name of national security. A culture that dampened conscience and sidestepped accountability. A culture internalized in families like my own. I now recognize that inheritance in my own fear of digging into this history. Eventually, I was able to track down one of my grandfather's old psychiatrists. He told me that my grandfather was tortured by guilt for his part in contaminating his home. This is something my grandfather never said to his family. Secrecy separates us. So when I put the pieces back together, the story of Oak Ridge with the stories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Nevada and the story of my family, there was a reminder of our deep interconnectedness. That when we build bombs bound for elsewhere, we poison our own backyards, our minds even. Local and planetary health, as we know, as everyone in this room knows, are intimately tied. And we all have a stake in eliminating the forces of our own destruction, whether they're bombs, guns, or fossil fuels. As it turns out, no place on Earth is free of the fingerprints of nuclear testing. Our stratosphere is still stitched in fallout. No place on Earth is pure, unmarked by human industry. So we have to look to our backyards. We can't give up on the hurt places we love best. We need to dig deep, uncover the complex and messy histories, and fight for the future. I'm grateful to the communities, activists, and organizations like SELC still fighting for Oak Ridge and other landscapes poisoned by our own hands. And I'm grateful for this chance to share something of the South I love, complicated as it is. And I'll just close by reading a short section from the book. At night, the shift between the city and outside is sudden and startling. One moment, there are streetlights and strip malls, and then, just past the west gates, the empty white guardhouses that once controlled access to the K-25 plant. The road is dark, long and lonely, lined on either side by a gray smudge of trees. As I left town one night, my headlights flashed against the reflectors on the roadside barrier and the tape in the lane divider, structuring my path with a bright rhythm through the otherwise unnerving stretch of nothing. I turned on the radio, flipped through the channels, top 40s, a local live bluegrass broadcast, several country music stations. Then there was the musical drawl of a radio pastor, and I paused. Philosophy tells me I can tell you more and more about less and less, but I can't save you. Well, I'm here to tell you there's someone who can save you. I turned the radio off, and it was just the sound of my tires on the asphalt, the rush of air past my windows. Finally, there is no knowing, no certainty in a place with such widespread and complex contamination as Oak Ridge, in a place that has been steeped for years in an oppressive culture of secrecy. It comes down to a kind of faith in the body, in the numbers, in the institutions meant to protect us. I don't think the world can be reduced to numbers. In the cracks between the numbers are real lives, real bodies. There are the maybes and fears and what-ifs. There are the hazards we did not consent to face. I believe this land, these people were hurt. I believe it matters that the fish and the spiders still carry elevated concentrations of mercury that can be magnified through the food chain when eaten by birds and bats, that radioactive materials still trickle into the streams and rivers that flow downstream. The Superfund mandated cleanup of Oak Ridge is due to be complete by 2047. What, I asked Dave Alder from the DOE, does it mean to be complete? That's a good question. He laughed and explained that it meant, quote, honoring all regulatory commitments, unquote, to the state, to the EPA. But yes, he conceded, contaminated groundwater and waste burial grounds will require monitoring indefinitely. Toxic disasters, writes sociologist Kai Erickson, violate all the rules of plot. They never end. Invisible contaminants remain a part of the surroundings, absorbed into the grain of the landscape, the tissues of the body, and worst of all, the genetic material of the survivors. An all clear is never sounded. The book of accounts is never closed. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Emily. It is my pleasure to present you with the 2024 Reed Environmental Writing Award for Nonfiction Book. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. We're going to take a picture to your left. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next, it's my pleasure to introduce the winners of the Reed Environmental Writing Award for Journalism. Mario Ariza and Miranda Green from Floodlight News, along with NPR's David Folkenflik, who unfortunately was unable to join us in person today, but will join us virtually in just a few moments. Together, these three talented journalists produced the award-winning story In the Southeast, Power company money flows to news sites that attack their critics. In the South and across the country, monopoly electric companies wield immense influence over our everyday lives, from the size of our electric bills to the climate impacts of our energy use. Here at SELC, we see time and time again utilities fighting against everything we need from them right now, including energy affordability, the transition to renewable energy sources like solar and wind, and the responsible cleanup of pollution generated by their power plants. And because of this award-winning story from Floodlight News and NPR, we now know that at least 2 power companies are taking this fight even further. Not just pushing back against progress, but literally paying to control the media narrative. But first, a little bit about Floodlight News. Floodlight is a nonprofit newsroom focused on investigating and revealing the powerful corporate and ideological interests stalling climate action. Since its founding in 2021, Floodlight's reporters have broadened their reach and impact by collaborating with other media outlets, from The Guardian to the Texas Tribune to, of course, NPR. For this winning story, Mario Ariza and Miranda Green partnered with David Folkenflik at NPR to investigate how utility giants in the South wield corrupt influence over small, often underfunded newsrooms. By funneling money to these media outlets through a consulting firm, Alabama Power and Florida Power and Light have been able to essentially buy favorable coverage, suppress opposition to their agenda, and even smear their critics. It's truly shocking. Journalism like this underscores the importance of independent investigative journalism at a time when many local news outlets are disappearing, and others are facing shrinking budgets that leave them vulnerable to the kind of dirty tactics exposed in this story. Please help me welcome the 2024 Reed Award winners for journalism from Floodlight, Miranda Green and Mario Ariza.
Good evening, everybody. I'd like to start by just polling the room. My name is Mario Ariza, by the way. This is Miranda. Have any of you ever received a leaked record? Just by a show of hands, have you ever gotten something you shouldn't have gotten your hands on? Okay. Has anybody ever leaked a record here? No, please don't. Thank you. So this story would not have happened if it weren't for those leaked records. But where do they come from, right? Well, they come from a good old-fashioned Southern feud. And because of that feud, I was lucky enough to get my hands on some of those records. Let me tell you a little bit about that conflict. It was a business divorce between 2 political consultants that got pretty ugly pretty fast. The consultants worked for some of the largest power companies in the country, namely here Southern Company and Florida Power and Light. And as they were feuding, they had a lawsuit against each other. Newspapers across the Southeast started getting some of these records. But they couldn't drive the story all the way home. And it wasn't until we started kind of helping them out that we started noticing that these records spoke to the secret political life of these power companies, how they played kingmaker in contests large and small, how they protected their bottom line and boosted fossil fuels and even controlled the media narrative. So power companies get to keep the name of their political contractors secret. It wasn't always like this, but it's like this today. And they get to keep a lot of their political giving absolutely secret. So our first big challenge when we got these records was trying to really grasp just how wide and how deep this story went, right? Like, where were these guys operating? So we tracked their flight records. We scoured the websites that we suspected had received money from them, and we tracked every article in spreadsheet after spreadsheet. We followed the money through dozens of dark money 501c4 social welfare organizations, essentially political committees that function that way. And we spent months talking to hundreds of sources. Eventually, we tracked the consultants to at least 10 states. These guys were operating in at least 10 states. And we followed their money to these 6 media outlets. But the truth is that it took the unraveling of this consulting company for us to even be able to start piecing this together. Our second biggest challenge was verifying the leaked records. Right? Now, for those folks that raise their hands about receiving those things that they shouldn't have gotten, you can't always trust what you get from a stranger on the internet, right? So how do you figure out if this stuff is real? And a lot of our work went into verifying non-public information in these records. I mean, we literally had ledgers, and we were calling people up being like, hey, were you at this place at this time? Did you do work with this person? Because sometimes that was the only way we could learn to trust the records that we had. I mean, and sometimes we went back to these sources 5, 6, 7 times, talking to them for hours before we were absolutely sure whether we felt safe enough to include one little bit of information from these records in publishing them. And there were some really high stakes in these interviews. There were interviews with power company CEOs, and with newspaper editors who I think are still a little cross at me.
Just a little.
And there were some really scary moments, like when we learned that one of our fellow reporters had been followed by a private eye paid for by these consultants. And there were multiple threats of lawsuits. But the reason that we did these stories, right, what was at stake? Well, Miranda's going to tell you about that.
Thank you, Mario. Not as good as ad-libbing as Mario is, so I brought some notes here. So when Mario, David, and I agreed to embark on this story, I don't think that any of us quite knew how deep it was going to go. Mario and I had already been reporting on a small consulting firm called Matrix and the work that it was doing on behalf of the utility Florida Power and Light. After we published our first big story in The Guardian, we got a call. Now, at first, we thought that David Folkenflik just wanted to interview us about the piece for NPR. Well, little did we know that he had some grander ambitions. He instead was thinking about writing his own story to focus on some of the media elements that we had touched on in our previous piece. He wanted to know if we had any suggestions on where he should dig. Well, I told him we could do one better. Mario and I actually still had hundreds of internal documents outlining Matrix's work with news companies. So I asked him, would NPR like to partner on a story? I remember David responding in a very David way. I think he was probably stroking his mustache or chin. Now, that sounds like fun. And we were off. After 5 months of reporting, our story had all of the hallmarks of a John Grisham novel. Bitter ex-business partners, wronged spouses, private investigators, and instances of spying, even on reporters. But while the piece feels crazy on its face, it is also a tale as old as time. It's a story about money and power and greed. And it's also a story about climate change and the extent that powerful interests are willing to go to protect their bottom line, even if it means sacrificing the public and the environment. Such was the case for Terry Dunn, an Alabama resident who wanted to do right by his neighbors and figure out why their power bills were so high. And I'm talking really high here. Alabama residents have the highest power bills of any state in the country, despite being one of the poorest. So in 2010, Dunn ran for a seat on the State Energy Commission. He wanted to hold a formal rate hearing at which Alabama power executives would have to open up their financial books and answer some questions. They hadn't done that in nearly 3 decades. But Dunn soon found himself the target of political online smears, and he lost his re-election campaign to a catfish farmer. But what Dunn hadn't known at the time is that the news sites that had attacked him were taking money from Matrix, the consulting firm. Our reporting revealed it was an orchestrated attack, and Dunn was not the only target. By verifying the trove of documents that we had received and following the money, we traced a web of 6 news outlets across Alabama and Florida with financial connections to Matrix. we found that between 2013 and 2020, Matrix paid the 6 news outlets just under $1 million. Through the sites, Matrix shrewdly took advantage of the near collapse of local news industry and found a way to push its own messaging. Those articles were influential in shaping state policy, including around solar in the Sunshine State. When reporting this story, we realized we had more than we could fit into one piece, and we actually did a second story on this in the same series about how a Matrix hired an ABC News reporter to attack power company critics. She also happened to be dating one of the founders of Matrix. We are proud of both of these stories, and they both had real impact. A month before this story was published, Alabama Power's CEO, Mark Crosswhite, announced his retirement, well after our reporting had been underway. And a month after this story came out, Florida Power and Light's CEO, Eric Szilagyi, can never pronounce that right, announced his early retirement unexpectedly. I wanted to thank you so much for the acknowledgement of this work in supporting investigative journalism, especially at a time where there's so little of it, and for acknowledging the work of my colleague Mario and I and David. David was sad that he could not be here, but he did tape something to address us all, and I will tee that up to you.
Hi, my name is David Folkenflik, and I'm the media correspondent for NPR News. I want to thank the Southern Environmental Law Center for this recognition, the Reed Award. I'm so appreciative of it. And I also want to say how sorry I am I can't join you. My daughter, Zella, is having her 9th birthday today, and I think it's better that I be here with her. But nonetheless, I appreciate this recognition for the accountability journalism that we sought to do. This project really sought to show what happens behind the scenes. You have major corporate actors, major political consultants, and a seemingly connected web of journalistic actors with hidden agendas, motives, and profit centers that led to a withholding of full information from the public, a kind of poisoning of the well from which we draw information. This really was an attempt to offer accountability journalism with consequences for what happens for the people, in this case of Alabama and Florida. You know, a few weeks ago, Miranda told me that Terry Dunn had died earlier this year. He really was the beating heart of this story, a guy who ran for office for the board that regulates public utilities, power companies in Alabama, and believed what he said, the idea that major companies and political figures should be accountable to the public. He wanted a rate hearing. Why did that matter? It meant that Alabama Power would have to lay open its books to the public. They'd have to understand their profits. They'd also have to explain how they set their rates, which had both economic and environmental consequences. Terry Dunn, of course, was kept from doing that, hounded from office in part because of the dynamics that we documented in the political and journalistic spheres. As you've probably heard from Miranda and Mario already, I kind of stumbled onto this story when calling them about one of their earlier related stories about some of the political consultants operating behind the scenes. I couldn't be prouder of our collaboration together. I'm so appreciative that they let me in, and then we did this work together in true partnership. They are terrific journalists, but Mario and Miranda are also even better people, and I'm proud to call them colleagues and friends. So my thanks to them, and also my thanks to you on this wonderful night. Take care.
Thank you. That was really wonderful. It is my pleasure to present you, both you all, with the Reed Environmental Writing Award for Journalism. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Don't forget we're going to do photos.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Now, before we close our event today, we have some time left for questions for our award winners and our guest speaker. So I will ask Jonathan, Emily, Mario, Miranda to join me here at the front of the room. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions for the program. We'll get to as many of them as we can before the program ends. So the first question up is for you, Jonathan. What have you found to be different between reporting for TV and writing a book?
A lot. Television is adrenaline fueled. You are rushing into the unknown, and you are discovering every step of the way. With Lahaina, as I mentioned earlier, when we first arrived, we had no idea what that story would evolve into. Writing came from a place of knowledge. We'd already pieced together part of the puzzle. And then the difficulty or the challenge with writing a book I found, aside from how much time it took and trying to find the appropriate hours to do it, was trying to figure out the best way to be concise and to tell the story in a way that was clear and I thought would resonate. And obviously without images and the power of television. It's one thing to cover a story, a storm specifically, where you see flames behind you or wind and rain. It's another thing to have to find the right words that bring those images to life to help readers feel like they are part of that journey and in that environment and connecting with the science that's in the book and the real world consequences unfolding as a result.
Thank you. Emily, I know you're used to this question.
Okay.
How long did it take you to write your book from idea to published story?
Okay. Yeah, it took about 10 years. Wow. Yeah.
So do you want to tell a little bit about when you first had the idea for the book, and so to give more context for.
Of course, yeah. So there was this photograph that hung above my bed when I was a child, where I slept when I visited my grandmother at that lake house that I described. It showed my grandfather standing in front of a nuclear test blast. And it was haunting at the time, but I didn't think much of it. And then I kind of forgot about it. And years later, many, many years later, when I was in college, after my grandmother had died, I started to remember this photograph. I was about to graduate college, and I was thinking about what kind of person I was going to be in the world. And I was kind of pulled back to this emotional place, thinking about the place that I had felt most safe as a child. And suddenly remembered this strange image and started to think, what was that? What was that all about? Like, why my grandfather worked on this stuff? Like, it wasn't a history that we had really discussed. So I sort of felt compelled to dig in and find out, like, what does this history mean about, what does the existence of this photograph mean about my family, this history, this place that I love, about me. So that's kind of where it started. And then there were years when I didn't, that's where the idea come from. There were years that I didn't work on it as much, and then I went to grad school, got my MFA in creative nonfiction at University of Minnesota. That's kind of where I started to dig in more deeply and do research both within the family and then go out. I spent a lot of time in Oak Ridge, a lot of time interviewing people, a lot of time reading, like, in archives, reading environmental reports, public health studies, trying to put together the pieces, talking to scientists, trying to make sense of a history that's very complex and big and also very personal to me.
Thank you. Miranda, so what is the role that independent news sources play in educating the public about climate issues? So even more detail than what you've already provided.
Yeah. I mean, I think climate change is it's a complex issue and also a very basic issue. You know, we are no longer at the place where we are debating the science, but when I first started covering climate change, there were no climate reporters. I was an environmental reporter and I covered energy. And when we did cover climate change, it was still believed that we had to have both points of views about what climate change was, which meant that I wrote a story with a climate scientist and a climate denier. And that was the right way to write journalism because you wanted to be unbiased. We've come a long way in a really short period of time, and it's weird to think that, less than 10 years ago, that was still how I was writing stories. Independent news is important because it seeks to find the truth and cut through obfuscation and PR and spin. Climate change is a reality. It's based in science. We are no longer debating whether it's happening. Now we're not even necessarily debating how to fix it. Scientists know how to fix it. We know what we're supposed to be doing in order to address this issue. We have countries that are making commitments to do so. As reporters, our job is to dig into whether that's happening, whether those promises are real, and the bad actors who don't want those things to be happening. And so, the role that we play is in, watchdog journalism, really making sure that, the people who are going out there and saying they're doing certain things are doing it, making sure that the public is getting real, trustworthy information, and making sure that, we have all the facts in a digestible way so that we can ask the right questions.
Mario, so I have a question, so as a lawyer, we're bound by rules of professional conduct, and there are expectations for how we go about practice. As journalists, what codes do you expect that journalists should be bound by in terms of, reporting? And how do you keep each other honest?
Yeah. Well, so there's no single Jedi holocron that's going to tell you what a reporter should act like, and there's or a journalist should act like, and there's no bar association, right? Journalism is a profession that polices itself by reporting on itself, right? That's why we partnered with David, who is a media reporter. But there is a code of ethics, right? And that is tell the truth. Right? Tell the truth about where your money's coming from. Tell the truth about your priors if you're not going to be objective about a situation. Be honest about why you can't. And in all situations, strive to be as honest and forthright and as fair as you can be with folks. Now, there are different models out there, right? One of the folks that we wrote about practices what he calls combination, quote, unquote, journalism, right? That's journalism where people are paying him, and he's putting stuff in there and labeling them as stories, but really it's advertising, it's PR, right? And if you're not being honest with your readers about the difference between what is going to be straight reporting and what is going to be advertorial or even editorial stuff, you're doing them a disservice, and you're doing all of us a disservice. So that's why we write about this stuff, right?
And I think, as a follow-up on that, with so many different places that we can consume information now, how do you think, as a investigative journalist, how do you think that you can capture the minds of the greatest number of people with the right information?
Great question. So two things. Every audience is going to have a different thing that it wants, right? And a different medium is going to reach that audience. And often, and this is what an old media theorist called Marshall McLuhan used to say, the medium is the message, right? So your tweet is a different medium, but it's also a different message than a piece of long-form investigative journalism that people are going to need 2 cups of coffee to get, right? But as long as you're striving to tell the truth in all of them, right? And as long as you're being honest and transparent, and you're holding people accountable and you're practicing journalism, I don't know how you make money off of it, but you will have an impact, right? And it's about telling these stories in as many different formats as possible to reach both broad audiences and the policymakers who need to have the information in hand as well.
Emily, I have another question for you that is about survivors. You know, survivors of the legacy of the TVA spill in Tennessee, and even survivors of Hiroshima. And thinking about what happened to families who were cleaning up after the TVA spill, and what maybe people were exposed to in the cleanup, and people who have lived through Hiroshima, people who have, that you spoke to when you went to visit, and what you may think now of through lines and experiences. Because as I was reading about the people who died after cleaning up TVA spill waste, I was shocked because I didn't expect that. This is, 2008. This is a huge spill of coal ash. And coal ash has been work that SELC has done. Coal ash cleanup has been work that SELC has done for a long time. And we don't necessarily, I don't think about people dying associated with coal ash until I've read this part of your book. And the connections that you make between Oak Ridge and Hiroshima, and then the connection of people who have died cleaning up waste that was close to, your home. What connections do you think there are between those places and the families of those people, or if you've thought about that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So for a little bit of historical context, this plant that leaked to where the coal ash, the waste containment pond burst in December of 2008 and sent tons and tons of this toxic coal ash into the surrounding land and waterway. This plant was actually built in the 1950s to power Oak Ridge, to power the nuclear weapons industry there. So there's a direct historical connection between these two disasters. And I did go to Hiroshima as part of my research and spoke to atomic bomb survivors there. I think maybe the connection goes back to what I said a little bit about interconnectedness, that there is, in all of this history, we see a profound lack of consideration for human life and land, and we see profit motives. Certainly, the nuclear weapons industry is driven as much by profit as by national security, if not more so. Maybe that's something for the investigative journalists to get into. But yeah, I think another connection I see is in the survivors' fight. So the survivors, the cleanup workers who now, some 10 years after the spill, about dozens had died of people who had been working on cleaning up this ash spill. They weren't allowed to have protective equipment. They were laughed at when they said that they were having respiratory problems, and then they developed all these health issues. And hundreds more are sick, and there have been a series of lawsuits that are ongoing to get them compensation. But they're still fighting, right? They're still working through heartbreak and health impacts, and fighting for justice for themselves and their families. Just as nuclear weapons survivors, many of them have spent their lives fighting for weapons abolition, speaking about the worst, most traumatic day probably anyone could ever imagine, again and again and again, for the sake of a better world that where this wouldn't happen to anyone else. So there is a resilience there that I see, and there's the historical connection.
Thank you. And this is for any one of you who'd like to answer this question. As you're continuing to write, you can elaborate on where do you find inspiration for your stories? I mean, the environment and climate, of course, but if there's more elaboration this is one of the questions, if there's more elaboration you'd like to give on that.
I think it's a great question. For me, I kind of to what Emily was talking about, I focus on the survivors whenever I try to, as much as possible, once the dust has literally settled from wherever we are. I think that through those stories, others who are luckier in life can connect in ways that they otherwise may not be able to. They can understand the world around them through those stories. And I focus on survivors specifically when writing this book because they were truly the most inspiring to me, and I hope that that would inspire others. There's this one family, a mother and daughter, who survived the campfire in Paradise, and they immediately returned. They were living in a trailer outside of town. There was no doubt about where they were going to live and rebuild. It was going to be in Paradise. And so many people thought they were crazy, but to them, this was all about reestablishing their roots, connecting to their tradition. And in their eyes, they saw a blank slate and a new way to build back in a more resilient way using federal funding. It took them 2.5 years to get their home and to remove the vegetation around it. Paradise looks very different today, but they moved in 2.5 years later, and that story resonates to me. And also the idea of home that they now have in their minds. It's not just a physical place, it's the place where those that you love are. And I find connecting with survivors to be the best way for me to understand different perspectives. So I hope to pass that on in the stories that I cover.
Thank you. So Miranda and Mario, so I'm from Kinston, North Carolina, and it's a place where power bills are really, really high because of a failed electric compact with a cooperative called Electricity. So people's electric bills are regularly like $400 a month, very, very low income part of Eastern North Carolina. And you know, I hear your story and I'm listening to it really fired up, really angry, really upset. And I'm excited you have this 7-minute story that gets published and I get to listen to it. And I think there are probably lots of Alabamians who are going to be excited, fired up, or were excited, fired up to hear your story, that it's compressed. And then I hear you say it's 5 months of work put into this. How do you feel to get, what is it like to cut down 5 months of work into 7 minutes of a story? Like to all of, you know.
What's the phrase that you like to tell me? Save it for the book. There's a lot, like, you got to kill a lot of darlings, right? You gotta leave a lot of stuff out.
I think one of the best quotes I ever got told by someone was, "No one ever knows the quotes you leave out. It's just you." So you, as the reporter, you've gone through, you know, dozens of interviews, sometimes over months and months. You've talked to some of these sources every single day, and every time you talk to them, you're like, "Oh, that's a money quote. Oh, I got to include that. I got to include that." Maybe one makes it in the story, maybe. You know, but the truth is that all of the work you've done, even with that one quote, has, you know, given you the backbone you need to write the piece in the best way. So you have to think it's all a culmination of work, even if it doesn't necessarily all get in there.
Yeah, and you'll do dozens of interviews for a story. Maybe one of the 12 people that you interview gets quoted, but every single one of them teaches you something. And it's really useful because when you end up talking to other folks, perhaps maybe they're a trade group for the industry, and they try and pass off something that isn't the most accurate, you can catch it, right? So it is all worth it.
Spoken from personal experience.
Yeah.
So Jonathan, there's so many stories, thank y'all. There's so many stories in your book, and I wanted to at least have you get to share a snippet, something more that the audience can hear you talk about that's really indicative of a lesson that we can take home before we close out today. If you'd like to share something That's a great message.
Yeah, I close out the book talking about iguanas in Florida. Every year in the past decade or so, 2 decades now, when it gets too cold in Florida, iguanas, which are an invasive species, they were introduced by pet owners. They live in trees, and when the temperature dips below 40 degrees, they go into a hibernative state, form of self-protection. And so when it is cold enough, it is possible for it to literally rain iguanas. And when I worked in Miami at WPLG, an ABC affiliate, I was sent out to document this to see if it actually did happen. So I went to a golf course in the middle of the night. We set a camera up on a tree. Everywhere we heard the plopping of something falling. It sounded like golf balls. And sure enough, there were frozen iguanas in the trees everywhere. And once we put our camera on just one, because we kept missing all of them falling, we captured it. To this day, it is still used on Jimmy Kimmel. And while it happened a lot early on, from I would say this was around 2011, there is research that shows the iguana has this incredible ability to adapt to its environment. And so it got more tolerant to cold. So these days, unfortunately for people who like raining iguanas, it doesn't rain iguanas as much. And I guess the point that I make in this part of the book, and I hope it's kind of the entire part of the book, is if an iguana brain can adapt to its environment, so can we with all of the technology and infrastructure that we have, all of the solutions out there. We've got to be able to figure out a better way forward. I still think that there are a lot of people that do question climate change. That's one thing, but then it's about seeing the solutions clearly and giving people the information so that they can do that as individuals, implement it. And hopefully you get individual communities following, and then you get the federal government, and you get the whole world. Frozen iguanas.
Well, thank you all for your contributions today. Congratulations to the winners. And that concludes our ceremony for today. Thanks everyone for coming to celebrate these extraordinary environmental writers. And as a reminder, if you're interested in purchasing an advanced copy of Jonathan Vigliotti's new book, Before It's Gone, our local bookstore partner will have copies available for sale as you exit. And we hope you have a wonderful weekend, and thank you again for joining us today.